Hello and welcome back to another episode of Whiskey Uncorked. Today we're going to be doing another whiskey review, and this time we'll be discussing the core range offering from the Isle of Raasay Distillery in Scotland. Now this may come as a shock to you, but the Isle of Raasay Distillery is located on the Isle of Raasay in Scotland. Now being on an island, not being an islet, it is considered a Highland Scotch whiskey, and they released their first 3-year-old whiskey back in 2020. Since then, they have been releasing 2 core range batches every year since then, with the most recent one being bottled in October of 2023. And that sort of leads us into what our kind of overarching topic is going to be today. We're going to do a review of the bottle, but then as you come to know on these Monday videos, we tend to get into a little bit deeper conversation, either a personal anecdote, personal experience, and then ultimately there will be some industry conversations and just some opinions of mine. But Raasay's batching policy is something that we're going to discuss, and I didn't really expect to. You see, this is the first bottle of Isle of Raasay that I have purchased. Being in the States, we do get their core range bottling, obviously. I did buy this here. We do also get single barrel bottlings. But I was holding off a little bit. I was waiting to kind of see what some of the response was. I actually didn't buy this until like the second half of last year. Now, in terms of batching, when I bought this bottle, I didn't really pay any attention to that because I didn't care what batch it was. I just wanted to get a bottle of it so I could kind of understand where this distillery currently was and see if a lot of the great things that people were saying about it were in fact true. Now, once I received this bottle, at some point upon further inspection, I realized that this bottle did not have a batch number on it anywhere. Now, normally on their core range bottling, you can see it says Isle of Raasay here, and just to the right of Isle of, normally it says batch, which is printed on the label, and then there is a stamped batch number. Now, their batch numbers tend to be, or at least so far have always been R, and then 01 dot something. So the 01 stands for the spring release. So it's the first release of the year. And the 02 stands for the fall release or the second release of the year. It's then followed by a decimal point and a 1 or a 2, which would indicate that that was the first release of their spring batch. So R01.1, as I mentioned, is their first ever spring release. In 2021, they released just the R01. And that was the inaugural release. In 2022, they released the R1.1. And then this past year in 2023, they released the R1.2. Their most recent release is the R2.2, which again would have been bottled in the fall of 2023. If you go on their website, under their whiskey section, you can see they actually have a tab for each one of those releases that I mentioned. And you can get a pretty good amount of information about them. Unfortunately, this one not having a batch number on it, I have no clue about what any of that information is. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that after the review, and I'll throw out some caveats. I don't know why that this is the case. I have some strong feelings about it if this is going to be kind of how this goes in the future with future releases. If this was a one-off thing, maybe it's understandable. But I do have some strong feelings as to like batch numbering, particularly for a whiskey like this one. All right, so let's talk about the bottle a little bit. I'll give you what information I can give you. On the website, if you go and you actually find your batch number, they give you tons of information from the type of barley, the type of yeast, the fermentation times, and maybe most interestingly, at least for me, would have been the percentage of casks that they use. On the side of the bottle here, they show their 6 casks, peated and unpeated. And actually, now that I mention it, I forgot to mention it just a second ago, but The one thing that I know is that this was probably bottled in 2022 or later, meaning that it wasn't one of the first R releases. And that's because on those first R releases, the O1 and the O2 with no decimal number, the little grid here, this one has like perforated lines separating each of the barrel types, and those first R01 and R02s didn't seem to have that on their label. So that's like my only indication that this was probably bottled in 2022 or later. But yeah, so each of these casks go into each of their core ranges, but those percentages can change based on flavor profile and overall quality. They're not vatting to make the same whiskey over and over again. They are trying to basically make the best whiskey they can while still staying in a relative range of what they consider to be their profile. All right, so outside of that, the bottle says that this is a 700 milliliter bottle. It is 46.4% ABV. It is non-chill filtered and natural color. That it is lightly peated. The only tasting notes I see on here are balanced with notes of rich, dark fruit flavors. And that's pretty much it. They have a little bit of a story about the geology of the island. There's an island population of 161 people. And pretty relatively bare bones, which is fine. And Ardnamurchan is famous for having their QR code where you scan the bottle and it will take you directly to a page that gives you every piece of information about that bottle you could ever possibly want. The Isle of Raasay's page will give you probably the information you would find to be most relevant in a somewhat more simplistic and straightforward format. All right, well, since I can't give you any more information about this specific batch of Isle of Raasay, why don't we get into our tasting now? All right, first let's check this thing out on the nose. I mean, the first thing you're going to be met with is mineral water. It's very mineralic and grain notes, which are telltale signs, particularly the grain note of a younger malt whiskey. Obviously, the bottle says that it is lightly peated, and that makes perfect sense. It is pretty lightly peated. It's fairly evidently peated, but it is light. We're not talking a big, super medicinal Isla smoke here. This is more beach campfire smoke, similar to kind of the Highland Park bottling review I just did, the single cask Nords of NorCal video, where I was talking about that big time notes of char. I'm kind of getting those on a much fainter level, but the smoke is a little bit more present on this one, even neat. Fruit-wise, there's some apple. In fact, one of the nostalgic notes that I got here took me back to college, where we would make like a punch for a party, and we would start by getting cutting up a couple bags of apples and pouring and soaking them in the cheapest vodka we could find. But that very distinct appley, but that grain or neutral alcohol smell is definitely in here. Now, one of the 6 barrels that they do use is ex-Bordeaux casks. And you can pick up a slight kind of red fruitiness. It's kind of sweet. It's a sweeter note. It's a little bit juicy, but it's pretty faint. It's not picking up a lot. It's in the background. And I would say that kind of apple and maybe some lemon, maybe a little bit of citrus as well, are probably more prominent than the red note. So overall on the nose, it's a young whiskey. There's not much else to say about it. It's certainly not grabbing me and transporting me to a magical place. It's not off-putting in any distinct way, unless you just really dislike that grain alcohol note. It's It's there. It's not overwhelming, but it is fairly present. And that's not surprising. That's not a knock against Isle of Raasay or this particular bottling. Even their most recent release, which this is almost certainly is not, is a vatting of 3 to 5 year old Scotch whiskies. And at that age, you're almost certainly going to be getting some of those notes. So basically what I'm looking for here is what direction is it heading? And I'll get a little bit more into that once we start talking about the batch number and why that's important, and just not only related to this, but maybe other whiskeys of this type, and just whiskey in general, to be honest. But yeah, I didn't buy this expecting this to be the best bottle of whiskey that I had ever tried. I wanted something that was interesting, that indicated that this was going to be something to look forward to trying over the next few years, and just to see how much better this gets over time. So, nose is good. Obviously, I don't think I'd want all my whiskey to smell like this, but it's interesting enough, and it's very educational for me, who has not knows a lot of super young Scotch whiskeys. I've had like a Torvig, I've had a bunch of Ardnamarkens. I got almost a full shelf of them behind me. I've had a Loch Lee, and for the most part, I haven't went out of my way to pick up any of the other new distilleries that have released whiskey. All right, well, let's see how this young nose translates onto the palate. Cheers. Flavorful whiskey for sure. This is not an ultra refined whiskey. It has texture all the way through, but it is kind of that slightly tingly grain. You know you're drinking alcohol even at 46%. Not that it's hot, it's just very clearly a young whiskey. Now that doesn't exclude it from having really good flavors. I would say that the fruitiness on this is surprising. It was on the nose, that apple and that slight red fruit note with maybe a touch of citrus as well. Those fruity notes are much more prominent on the palate. Now it will be interesting to see how those fruit notes evolve over time. How much of those are from the distillate and how much of that is coming from their barrel choices, and the proportions that those have been vatted together. Peat-wise, it's like on the nose. It is present, but it's certainly not trying to be the loudest one in the room. It is a little bit more of that kind of charry smoke. It's not like barrel char. It's kind of like that campfire on a beach. Like in my mind, I'm thinking the white sun-bleached logs that you've gathered off of the beach, the driftwood, and you throw it into a fireplace right next to the ocean, and I can just picture like the edges of that white wood being charred by the fire, sort of thing. It's a pretty distinct mental image, but yeah, I stand by that. All right, let's have a second sip. Pretty decent mouthfeel overall. It's maybe a little thin when it first hits the palate. Don't get a lot of flavor on the front half of my tongue at first. Everything kind of picks more up in kind of the mid to back palate. A lot of people call out saltiness on Isle of Raasay and a lot of other coastal distilleries, island distilleries. Now obviously there is maybe not obviously, but there is no salt in the whiskey. Even if they are on the coast, there's not actually any salt, but you do occasionally taste salty whiskey, and it tends to seem to just kind of absorb the environment it's in, even though chemically there's not actually any salt in it. Now, I do get salt in here sometimes. It kind of goes back and forth between that kind of grain alcohol and saltiness. It's like they're kind of the same note, but sometimes one of them is prevalent and other times it's the other one. Now, obviously I'd rather have the salty note than the grain alcohol note, but that's just not always consistently the case. Onto the finish, probably get some more of that lemon, maybe more of like a lemon zest, lemon and some lemon pith. Finish is overall not super long, which was kind of disappointing because there are some good notes in there. You get that burst of fruitiness, and that kind of dies down pretty quickly, and kind of on the back half, you're not getting a very long finish. But again, that's understandable given this whiskey's age. All right, one more sip and then just kind of an overview. Cheers. Front half of the palate, I'm not particularly much of a fan. There's not much happening. I can kind of taste the alcohol. It just isn't really doing much. It's kind of thin, and it just kind of tastes like vodka at that point. And the best part is basically the middle to the back of the palate before it kind of dies off in the finish. And that's where you get this really nice burst of fruitiness. That's where that saltiness can come in, and the peat is there that kind of binds everything together. So overall, I think this is a pretty good whiskey for its age. Now, if you have watched my channel intro video, it was one of the main examples that I gave as why I started this channel, and that was to explore whether these young whiskeys were truly going to kind of be the savior of the Scotch whiskey industry. Not necessarily that the Scotch whiskey industry needs saving, but there was a time when these whiskeys were often described as being just good for their age. As more of them got released, and you had distilleries like Ardnamurchan Markin start releasing whiskeys that people were really honestly liking just for what it was, even at its 5, 6, or 7-year-old age statement. Or, I mean, there's no age statement, but you can tell how old via their QR codes, which again, these don't have. But people kind of started talking about these things a little bit differently, which may be unfair to some of the distilleries who are just releasing whiskey that they know isn't quote unquote ready, so they can recoup some of their investment, they can pay their employees, they can buy more barley, more barrels, that sort of thing. So judging this whiskey is kind of difficult, because if you're going to judge it against more mature products, at least in my opinion, this is gonna struggle. And I don't think even the makers of the whiskey themselves at Isle of Raasay are going to say, oh yeah, this is as good or better than some of the 10, 12-year-old core range bottlings that we've all come to love, like Deanston 12, Craigellachie 13, Bunnahabhain 12. I don't think anyone's gonna come out and claim that this is as good as those, or that they would rather drink this instead of those forever and ever. So giving the score can be a little bit difficult, because I think it's probably the most fair to try to judge this whiskey for what it's trying to be, even though maybe if it's in the same category as other whiskeys that I would almost always choose over it. I think it's fun. I think it is good. It is interesting. It just isn't something that I would want a shelf full of. It's fun to take this snapshot in time and kind of take some notes on where you think this distillery is now, and then check back in on it maybe in a couple years to see how it's evolved since then. So as far as a score goes, I think I'm going to play it safe here. I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10 average. I could definitely see giving it a higher score than that. I could see giving it a lower score than that. It probably is going to highly depend on my mood. But generally speaking, I think for a 3 or 4-year-old whiskey, which this is likely is, I mean, I don't think you really could have asked for more from a brand new distillery. This seems to be right on track. It's giving you enough peeks into what it could become in the future, and likely will become in the future. The one question I have is whether the peat content will increase over time as becoming a bigger percentage of the overall vatting, because it is pretty light, and if they want to maintain a bit of peatiness over time for longer aged whiskeys, are they going to continue to increase that the peat percentage, or the percentage of their peated spirit in these core range releases? Just for the fact that over time, generally speaking, peatiness tends to fade and kind of meld more into the background and isn't quite as prominent the longer a whiskey sits in the barrel. So yeah, I'm comfortable with 5 out of 10. Any flaws that it has are almost certainly due to how young it is, and it's doing enough good things overall to say, like, okay, this is probably at least, what you wanted out of a 3 or 4-year-old Scotch whiskey that is good enough to release to the public, but probably isn't meant to be the defining character of your distillery going forward. All of this leads me back into the topic I started talking about at the beginning of the video, and that is, what's this thing's batch number, and is that important? And really, realistically, I do think it's extremely important. Now, before I get into that, I looked online, I couldn't find an explanation. I couldn't really find out the extent to what these, to where these unmarked bottles were released to. At first I thought, well, maybe it's not just the United States, maybe it's just the export market. However, I did see that there was, I believe it was on dramface.com, there was a review of some of these bottlings, and there was a French-Canadian bottling, and it did have the batch number printed in French. There are other reasons why they may have omitted a batch number on this. Maybe it is a one-off, maybe they couldn't meet the demand with the official batch, so they kind of put together some more whiskey that was similar, and they didn't want to complicate their existing batch coding paradigm, and they made some more whiskey to meet the demand because more people wanted it, and that ended up being largely in the States. I have looked around, and it looks like most US websites, or all the ones that I could see, had like photos of the Isle of Raasay bottle and were selling it. Those bottles, those pictures also did not have a batch number on them, and I could not find a batch number anywhere else on the page. So someone out there may know the backstory to this. It's possible maybe that it was mentioned in some sort of an interview, but it's not mentioned on their webpage. There's no link or QR code for me to go get any details about this bottling. And to me, that's actually a pretty massive miss. That's a big deal to me. Now, why is it such a big deal? Well, it's because of what this bottle is and what it represents, and ultimately who's probably buying it. Here in the States, this is a $70 plus tax bottle. So out the door, this thing's going to be $75. And that's assuming you don't have to have it shipped to you, because not every store in the country, not every store in my area is probably carrying it. I'm either going to have to drive all over town looking for somewhere that's carrying it, or just order it online and pay an additional shipping fee. But let's assume $75. That's a lot of money for a 3 or 4 year old whiskey. So not anyone's just going to buy that bottle, especially for a new distillery that doesn't do a lot of marketing, that's been mostly catering to an enthusiast community. Obviously, it's the enthusiasts who are likely going to be their primary customers. So the batch number is important because I'm not buying this whiskey at $75 because I think it's going to be a $75 whiskey. I'm buying it for $75 because it is a unique experience to take a snapshot of a distillery in a given time. Now that snapshot is irrelevant if I can't find another snapshot in a couple years or so. How do I know what I'm comparing? If this one doesn't have a batch number and that one doesn't have a batch number, well, maybe they're the same batch. I have no idea. Maybe I can taste the difference, but at the end of the day, it's pretty irrelevant. Maybe one has a batch number and one doesn't. Same story. I can get a decent idea of the one with a batch number and look at how or where in the timeline that came out. But in relation, it doesn't really mean much to me. It seems there are people out there that are legitimately loving Isle of Raasay, and they're thoroughly enjoying their whiskey as is. Now, I have not had any of their single barrels or even some of their more special releases. I think I have access to their like Distillery of the Year edition, but that is over $100, and I wasn't going to spend that. But even then, I could buy that bottle and compare it to this one. But again, I now don't know any details about this. I don't know what I'm comparing it to. That special release has probably got its own special makeup of casks and what ages those casks are. If you truly just love drinking this spirit, you love this whiskey, and you just don't care, you're happy to explore just whatever version you can find and just kind of put that as a bit of a notch in your belt as you explore this new distillery, I can see that. But for me, I don't particularly love young Scotch whiskey. I can find it interesting. I can find positives about it, but I don't think it's the be all end all. And like I said, the ultimate future of Scotch. And these distilleries are in fact the future of Scotch, but the whiskey that they're releasing right now is not going to be. Now we'll have to see what these distilleries do in terms of age statements and ultimately what their core range settles on once they kind of hit that age of maturity. Ardnamurchan, I feel, is pretty close. I do think that their whiskey is much closer to being like legitimately good. I specifically enjoy drinking Ardnamurchan. They are a distillery where I do want to explore their different offerings and have some single barrels and some of their special releases and that sort of thing. And I haven't really regretted any of those purchases. Isle of Raasay isn't there yet. And they are obviously a couple years younger. They're not the same distillery. They have a little bit of a different style. They have a little bit of a different ethos in terms of their cask makeup and the wood that they use. I'm not sure how much I mentioned this, but they use, let's make sure I don't forget one here. You know, you have X-Rye whiskey casks, which is very unique. The Chinkapin oak casks, which are virgin oak, I believe. And then you have the Bordeaux red wine casks. And you have their peated and unpeated spirit that goes into all three of those cask types. So the more I thought about this not having a batch number on it, the more it annoyed me, especially when I came to wanting to do a review of it, because this is my first kind of new distillery review on this channel. I've reviewed exclusively established distilleries so far, and I was looking forward to getting into a little bit more nuanced conversation about how we should, or how you view, or how I view some of these new distilleries. Because there certainly are a lot of people out there that have completely gone all in on these young, brash, oftentimes brash, fiery spirits, and that's good. That's cool. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. For me, though, that's not typically why I drink Scotch, and especially for the prices. If this was what Scotch was, I'm probably going to be drinking a lot more bourbon. But that's me. That's okay. I'm still excited about these distilleries, and I'm cool giving these whiskeys a nice score. But the fun part is doing the comparisons, of following the story over time, and being online or with your friends and being able to discuss the differences between batches or to share batches. And I know it's kind of a poor me story, going online and maybe like looking to see like what other people think of this bottle. I couldn't find any reviews of someone talking about a bottle that didn't have a batch number on it. So it might be similar, and I can still watch those reviews and get information for sure. But I have a bottle here that maybe I want to drink along, or I want to at least maybe compare and contrast. And then if that batch that they're reviewing sounds good, maybe I could try to seek one of those out. And that's just not going to be possible for me, it seems. So hopefully all of this, at least with Isle of Raasay, is a one-off. It's something that's going to change. If they've explained themselves and they said this is a one-time thing, awesome. That's great. I'm not necessarily angry about it right now, although I was kind of getting worked up in my own head about it, because it seems like it's just the US that got these bottlings. Like I said, it looks like Canada got batch numbered releases, and it's like, oh man, like I'm left out in the cold here, especially trying to do a review. Like I can't even put like the batch number in like the title or anything like that. Again, it's a poor me story, and I get it if you're playing me the world's smallest violin right now. So hopefully this isn't an ongoing thing with Isle of Raasay, but you can certainly expand this conversation out to a bunch of other distilleries, all of them in fact. Now, do I expect Glenlivet and Johnny Walker and things to start putting batch numbers on their bottles? No. They are trying to make the same whiskey over and over and over again, and if they change something, oftentimes they don't want you to know that, so they aren't going to tell you that they've reduced the amount of sherry barrels, or that they're using more refill barrels, or just generally speaking, they're using less quality casks and raising the price because there's a new fancy label that they want to slap on the bottle. As an enthusiast, batch variation, I have no problem with. The real expectation is that a basic quality is maintained. And from there, the flavors can be a little different. It can be a little bit more this or a little bit more that. Totally fine. In fact, that can be fun. It can encourage me even to buy multiple bottles, particularly the really good high quality distilleries. It would be much more fun, even if it was a cryptic code on the bottle somewhere that we could type into the website. That's fine. It's kind of what Bruichladdich does, or at least I think with the classic laddie, at least. I'm not sure if I think the Port Charlotte as well. I have to check. I've got both of those bottles actually in the mail. But yeah, normally they have a little number that you can go type into the website, and you can find out all kinds of information about that specific bottle and batch, a la Ardnam Markin's QR code. So to wrap things up, batch numbers are good. If the distillery is confident in their whiskey and that they are trying to make the best whiskey they can every time, I don't see any reason why they can't put some form of batch number on it, even if it's just accessible to people in the know, like some sort of a code on the bottle. So as always, let me know what you think. Leave some comments. How much do you like these young, spirity distillery releases that are coming out almost monthly at this point? Is this whiskey that you would be happy to drink day in and day out, or completely replace your collection? Or are you someone who is more so waiting on these distilleries to reach maybe a little bit higher level of maturity and maybe to have their core range settle a little bit more? Or are you completely ignoring these types of distilleries? Are you just like, I'm not drinking 3-year-old scotch and I'm not paying $70 for the privilege, or 60 pounds or whatever you're paying where you are? I know some of these young distilleries are releasing their whiskey at exorbitantly high prices. Some of that may be to combat collectors and investors and that sort of thing, but and I guess if you want to pay over 100 pounds or $125 for a 3-year-old whiskey that you're never going to open, I mean, I guess more power to you. The distillery needs to make its money back. It's got its bills to pay and its investors to please, probably. Yeah, where do you stand? What's your favorite young distillery? I know probably a lot of you are going to say Ardnam Markin. That's probably my answer as well, at least of the ones I've gotten to try. But I am overall excited about where these distilleries are going. I just wish that I had a little bit easier time tracking them from 3 years old to 5 years old to 7 years old to 10 years old, and just being able to follow that story, because that's really what we're talking about here. It is eventually going to be a story that this distillery is telling over the course of a decade, essentially, until they kind of hit that first plateau of 10 years old, which is maybe traditionally where Scotch whiskey is thought to really begin to shine. All right, well, thanks for sticking through a little bit of a rant. It wasn't as bad as the rant that was in my head like yesterday when I was going over this. I got myself pretty worked up, but realize that I don't know for a fact that this is how it's going to be. It's probably more than likely a one-off. If you know what's going on with this, please link it in the comments. Not to be wagging my finger at Isle of Raasay, because obviously they're doing good things over there. They're winning awards already. And I'm certainly excited to see where they go and how their profile matures over time. But until next time, guys, thank you. Cheers. Take care.